Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Thursday, Yom Hamishi. Let's light up the darkness. And Hodesh Tov, a good Hodesh. It's the new month of Nisan, the month of miracles, the month of Passover, the month of redemption. Please God, we should hear good news in this month. Let this war end with a secure and lasting peace, and God willing, a regime change to oust these psychopaths who hijacked Iran from the Persian people. Posted earlier today on the Facebook page, a young man, the national wrestling champion, 19 years old, joined the protests in January, and the Islamic regime executed him today, accused him of killing 2 cops. I mean, do you believe anything the Islamic regime says? They butchered 30,000 people in that protest. They lie constantly, and they always have. So may the poor young man's memory always be for a blessing. And please God, this terrorist-enabling regime and terrorist-filled regime should be removed from power, and let that happen soon, and let this war end, again, with a secure and lasting peace for Israel, for America, for that whole region. And perhaps we could enter a whole new era of economic prosperity, of peace, of, a whole new Middle East. It really could happen. Something I've been very pessimistic about in the past, and it may not happen now, but it could. It really could. And let us pray for that bright new age. Okay, who's in the house for our class on a Thursday? Rosh Hodesh Nisan. Renee in Indiana, Bell in Florida, Nancy, North Carolina, Yehudit in South Carolina, Paul in Providence, Bill in Missouri, Sharon in New Jersey, Lucy in Minnesota, Melissa in Great Neck, they're on the Bronx, Gail in Kansas City, Annette in Fort Lauderdale, Chaim in Florida, Moshe in Brooklyn, Lynn in Canada, Mickey in Vineland, New Jersey, Guy in Ohio, and Elise in Virginia. Our daf today is page 57 here in Tractate Menachot, the 30th volume of the Talmud. We're actually picking this up near the top of page 56b. 56b, a relatively short Amud, right, this half of the page. And then we'll get into 57, doing a single daf today. Reminder, no class tomorrow, Friday. We would normally do it at noon. But I'm blessed to be having a root canal tomorrow. And by the time I could teach the class, it would be late afternoon. I think it would be not good for people on the East Coast. And I really don't even know what state I'll be in after that procedure. So no class tomorrow, and we'll resume after today on Saturday night after Shabbos ends in LA. Okay, we're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 2 here in chapter 5 of Tractate Menachos. The sages were arguing about, there's the basic concept, no leavening for meal offerings, right? Any meal offerings that were brought when the temple was standing were brought with unleavened bread. 2 exceptions were the loaves of Shavuos and the 10 out of the 40 loaves that accompany a thanks offering. But every other, let's say 95% of all meal offerings, maybe more, 99%, were brought with unleavened bread. And if somebody introduced leavening into flour, a meal that had been consecrated as a meal offering, they'll be violating a prohibition. If they did it on purpose and were warned, they would be liable to lashes, flogging. I don't know how often or if ever that punishment was actually applied, but that would be the applicable punishment. More likely it was done inadvertently, but the point is prohibited, absolutely prohibited to introduce leavening. And what the sages were arguing about, actually, it's not only prohibited to introduce leavening into a meal offering, but then any of the steps of creating that meal offering, once it had become leavened, if you bake, if you knead, if you shape, if you smooth, those would all be violating separate prohibitions. And in order to derive that, we looked a little bit at the sin offering of a king and its position where it would be slaughtered in the yard, to sort of look at the hermeneutical principle of a generalization followed by a detail. And then we got a little bit into the weeds on other laws that use similar hermeneutical principles. And we're gradually working our way back to the meal offering. Okay, so near the top of page 56b. The sages disagree. And so now we're talking specifically on what if a meal offering had become leavened? Okay, so it's going to be disqualified. But what if somebody took a meal offering that had become leavened and introduced more leavening, right? Somehow made it even more leavened. But it was already disqualified by the first introduction of leavening. Would this second addition of a leavening agent to the dough also constitute the violation of a separate prohibition? Basically the answer is yes, it would. Okay, the sages disagree only with regard to one who inflicts a blemish on an already blemished animal, right? So by way of comparison, we also learned at the very end of yesterday that if a male animal had been sterilized, okay, so already it can't produce offspring. What if you then castrated it? Would that further violate the prohibition? Would that be a separate violation of the prohibition on sterilizing and castrating males? Answer, yes. Now we're talking about an animal that's consecrated to be an offering, or it's destined to be an offering, even if it hasn't been consecrated yet, like a bechor. I mean, I guess it's born consecrated in the sense that if it's the firstborn male offspring of a female kosher animal, it is a bechor, and it's going to be sacrificed in Jerusalem unless it develops a blemish. Then you can't sacrifice it. Okay, what if it already has a blemish? So you can't, on purpose, create that blemish so that you'll be excused from taking it to Jerusalem and offering it as the sacrifice of a bechor. Again, this is only when the temple is standing, and it hasn't in 2,000 years. But if you have an animal that's already blemished, what happens if you introduce a second blemish on that animal? Is that violating a prohibition? It's already blemished. Your second blemish doesn't really do anything, and yet you're not allowed to blemish a consecrated animal. The question is, even if it's already blemished? Right? So the sages disagree only with regard to one who inflicts a blemish on an already blemished animal, such as one whose blood circulation is constricted. Right, so there we learned yesterday that bloodletting was, in the ancient world, the medicinal cure for an animal that has this condition. So what they're saying, well, maybe that condition itself is a blemish. When you go to cure it, you're going to let blood. That might create a permanent blemish. Can you do that, given that it was already blemished? Maybe it's not a problem. Right? So they disagree only with regard to one who inflicts a blemish on an already blemished animal, such as one whose blood circulation is constricted. Rabbi Meir maintains that, as the verse states, it shall be perfect to be accepted, this animal offering. There shall be no blemish in it, from Leviticus 22:21. So this categorical statement includes even the infliction of a blemish on an offering that is already blemished. And the rabbis, meaning the majority who overrule Rabbi Meir, and the rabbis maintain that the phrase, it shall be perfect to be accepted, indicates that the prohibition against inflicting a blemish applies only to an animal that is currently perfect, i.e. unblemished, and can therefore be accepted, meaning that it is suitable to be sacrificed upon the altar. If the animal is already blemished, there is no prohibition against inflicting an additional blemish upon it because it is not fit to be offered on the altar. You're not changing that status of the animal by inflicting this second blemish since it's already unfit for the altar. Now, the Gemara analyzes this dispute. And according to the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who derives the law from the phrase, there shall be no blemish in it, isn't it written also, it shall be perfect to be accepted? And the Gemara answers, in other words, they both have the same verses. Why are they taking different meaning from the verses? So the Gemara answers, that verse serves to exclude only an animal that was blemished from the outset, i.e. an animal that was born with a blemish. In such a case, there is no prohibition to inflict an additional blemish on it. But if the animal was initially unblemished and later developed a blemish, it is prohibited to inflict another blemish upon it. Presumably that's the view of Rabbi Meir. Now the Gemara rejects this suggestion. There is no need to exclude an animal that was blemished from the outset, as it is merely like a palm tree, i.e. an item that can never attain the status of an animal consecrated as an offering. Therefore, it is obvious that the prohibition against inflicting a blemish does not apply to such an animal that never was fit for the altar since it was born unfit for the altar. So Rabbi Meir would not have made such a mistake. Rather, Rabbi Meir maintains that the phrase, quote, it shall be perfect to be accepted, serves to exclude disqualified, consecrated animals, to teach that after their redemption, when they become non-sacred, the prohibition against inflicting a blemish does not apply to them any longer. And this exclusion is necessary, as it might enter your mind to say that since it is prohibited to shear disqualified consecrated animals or use them for labor even after they have been redeemed and are non-sacred, perhaps let it also be prohibited to inflict a blemish upon them. Consequently, this verse teaches us that there is no prohibition against inflicting a blemish upon these animals. Now, the Gemara analyzes the opposite opinion of the majority of the rabbis. And according to the opinion of the rabbis as well, who base their opinion on the phrase, it shall be perfect to be accepted, isn't it also written, there shall not be any blemish in it, which indicates an expansion of the prohibition against inflicting a blemish? And the Gemara answers, that verse is necessary for that which is taught in a baraisa. The verse states, there shall not be any blemish in it, in Leviticus 22:21. So I have derived only that it may not have a blemish caused directly by human action. From where is it derived that one may not cause a blemish to be inflicted upon it indirectly? By means of other agents, for example, that one may not place dough or pressed figs on its ear so that a dog will come and take it, thereby biting off part of the animal's ear and leaving it blemished. So the verse states any blemish. It says blemish and it says any blemish. The word no serves to teach that one may not cause a blemish even indirectly, right? The fact that you didn't cut the animal on its ear to create that blemish, but you created a situation where, inevitably a dog was going to create such a blemish. Okay, you caused that blemish, and that is not permitted. Okay, we are moving on. The Gemara returns to discuss the leavening of a meal offering. Rabbi Ami says, if one placed leaven, i.e. dough that has leavened, to such an extent that it is no longer used as food, but rather as a leavening agent for other dough, and he places this on top of the dough of a meal offering, and then he went and sat himself down to wait, meaning that he performed no other action, and then the dough leavened of its own accord, so he is liable to receive lashes for it. Right? What we're talking about here is what degree of causation is there, right? So if you take starter dough, right, a leavening agent that already has some leaven to it, and you mix it in with fresh dough that doesn't have any leaven in it, okay, so clearly you've introduced leavening into that dough, and then if it's going to rise, you caused that. And if that was dough that was consecrated as a meal offering, you would have violated the prohibition. Okay, so now they're saying, okay, well, he didn't mix it in. Here's a little pile of dough that has been consecrated as a meal offering. He's got some other dough that is a starter leaven, starter dough as a leavening agent. And I suppose negligently, he just puts it on top of the consecrated dough. He didn't mix it in, but he left it on top in contact with the consecrated dough. And then he went off to do something else. And the dough underneath, perhaps in a shorter amount of time, wouldn't have leavened in that amount of time on its own, even though it has some water in it, let's say. But because of that proximity to the starter dough, the leavening agent that's on top of it, it does begin to leaven, right? Faster than it would have otherwise. Okay, so this guy is now responsible. He has violated the prohibition. It's not so surprising. And he would be liable to receive lashes for it if he did it on purpose and he was warned not to do it and he did it anyway in front of witnesses. Now, the Gemara questions this comparison. And is one liable for performing a prohibited... Now let me introduce the comparison. 11 of its own accord, he is liable to receive lashes for it. And, says the Gemara, this is similar to performing a prohibited action on Shabbos. What prohibited action on Shabbos? We shall see. The Gemara questions this comparison. And is one liable for performing a prohibited action on Shabbos in a case like this? But doesn't Rabba Bar Chana say, and now we're on page 57a, that Rabbi Yochanan says, in the case of one who placed meat on top of coals on Shabbos, if he subsequently turned over the meat to its other side so that both sides were roasted, he is liable for cooking on Shabbos, right? It's absolutely prohibited to cook on Shabbos. But if he did not turn over the meat, he is exempt, as the meat is considered cooked only if both sides were roasted. If so, the same should apply to one who places leaven on the dough of a meal offering. He should be liable only if he turns the dough over. And this contradicts the ruling of Rabbi Ami. So Rava said, what does Rabbi Yochanan as well mean when he says he is liable to receive lashes for it, similar to performing a prohibited action on Shabbos? He means that one who places leaven on the dough of a meal offering, even if he does not turn it over, is similar to one who performs a prohibited action of roasting on Shabbos, meaning that he is similar to one who turned over the roasting food on the coals. So is this to say that if you take a raw steak and you put it on a grill on Shabbos, as long as you don't turn it over, like obviously we'd always turn it over if we were cooking a steak properly, but if you don't turn it over, so it's going to be cooked on one side and raw on the other, maybe somebody likes it that way. Can you do that on Shabbos? By rabbinic law, certainly not. By Torah law, possibly. But the sages are going to argue some more about this. The sages discuss the matter itself. Rabbi Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says, in the case of one who placed meat on top of coals on Shabbos, if he subsequently turned over the meat, he is liable for cooking on Shabbos, and if he did not turn over the meat, he is exempt. So the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of this case? If we say that this was a situation where if he does not turn over the meat, it would not cook, then it is obvious that if he does not turn it over, he is exempt. Rather, it must be referring to a case where even if he does not turn over the meat, it would nevertheless cook. But if so, why isn't he liable for merely placing the meat on the coals, despite the fact that he did not turn it over? I mean, if the coals are in an oven, right? It's not just an open grill, but there's a kind of like a brick oven type of situation. You put the meat in there. It might cook more on the side that's facing the coals, but that whole meat is going to cook to some extent. And definitely you cannot do that on Shabbos. Now the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary to state this law in a case where if he does not turn over the meat, it would cook on one side only partially, roughly 1/3 of the ordinary process of cooking, like the food of Ben Derosai. Now, we've encountered Ben Derosai before. He was a guy involved with shady dealings, possibly as some kind of a bandit, who was always in a hurry to go from one shady deal to another. And so he would eat his meat barely cooked at all. This was kind of the original, seared tuna, seared ahi tuna type of guy, but that's how he did his meat. He would just kind of sear the outside, and it was blood red in the middle. Most people wouldn't eat their meat that way. Ben Dorosai did. It's not that the sages had such a fondness for this shady character, but they used his example of, well, here's a person, and maybe he and his cohorts would eat meat this way. So this would be like the minimum amount of cooking that would render meat edible to somebody, because this was a guy who was willing to eat meat with less cooking than anybody else, right? So he was the kind of extreme of how little a meat could be roasted and still be considered cooked so that it was rendered edible. They didn't hold by steak tartare, right? There was no steak tartare in the ancient world. Okay, so if you're saying that you're going to cook it only on one side, and that one side is only going to be 1/3 roasted, can you do that on Shabbos? Have you cooked the meat? Or is the act that you've done, Ben Dorosai would do that on one side and then on the other. So this is only half the cooking that even Ben Dorosai would do. So are we going to consider this a significant action so that you violated the prohibition on cooking on Shabbos or not? Let's keep reading. Right? So no, it's necessary to state this law in a case where if he does not turn over the meat, it would cook on one side only partially, roughly 1/3 of the ordinary process of cooking, like the food of Ben Dorosai. And now that he turns it over, it cooks on both sides, like the food of Ben Dorosai. And Rabbi Yochanan teaches us that any meat roasted on only one side and only like the food of Ben Dorosai, this is nothing. In other words, he has not actually engaged in cooking. This is not a violation of the prohibited labor of cooking on Shabbos. Again, this is by Torah law. The sages would add prohibitions on this to, keep us, to distance us from coming to even come close to violating the Torah law. So they certainly wouldn't allow us to put meat on coals or an open flame. We have a blech, which is something we might use to keep food warm on Shabbos, but it's only a warming agent. It's not a cooking agent. And there's a lot of rules about that too. You could put on the blech before Shabbos. Can you put it back on the blech after Shabbos begins? There's a whole lots of complexities about that. But the point is here that by Torah law, if you only cook one side and only to the extent that Ben Dorosai would cook it, so you haven't cooked the meat and therefore you haven't violated the prohibition of cooking on Shabbos according to Rabbi Yochanan. But if you roasted it on both sides, like the food of Ben Dorosai, 1/3 of what normal people would do, then you have cooked the meat. That is considered significant enough cooking, and you have violated the prohibition. The Gemara continues to discuss the case of meat roasted on one side on Shabbos. Rava says, and if a quantity of that meat equivalent in volume to a fig bulk was fully roasted on one side of the meat, and the roasted area was in one spot on the piece of meat, while the rest of the meat remained raw, he is liable for cooking on Shabbos. So Ravina said to Rav Ashi, it can be inferred from Rava's statement that if the fig bulk of meat that was roasted was in one spot, yes, he is liable. Whereas if the amount of the fig bulk was distributed over 2 or 3 separate spots, he is not liable. But didn't we learn in a Mishna, Tractate Shabbos 102b, one who drills a hole of any size is liable for the labor of building or the labor of striking a blow with a hammer to complete the production process of a vessel, and these would both be violations of the prohibition of labor on Shabbos, right? So now they're saying it's a more stringent opinion than Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was like the whole side, you have a steak and one whole side is on the coals, and if it gets roasted, at least 1/3 of what normal cooking would be, but only on one side, it's nothing. Both sides, you violated Torah law. Now, Rava is saying, forget the whole side. If you just cook by cooking it on one side, and there was a portion of that meat that has the volume of a fig that's roasted, you did it. You violated Shabbos. And then the question is, okay, well, what if there was like 3 little spots that together would add up to a fig bulk of roasted meat, but they're separated from each other? Is that going to trigger violation of the Shabbos cooking prohibition? One side says yes, the other side says no, and they're bringing as an example, what about drilling little holes on Shabbos, right? Drilling a hole, that's part of construction. Construction is definitely prohibited on Shabbos, but if the act that you're doing is so small and insignificant that it doesn't really amount to construction on Shabbos, maybe you haven't violated the law. So what about these 3 little holes? If there was one big hole, for sure, that violates the prohibition, but what about 3 little holes or 1 little hole? So the Gemara analyzes that Mishnah. What are the circumstances? If we say that the Mishnah is referring to one who drills a hole in one spot alone, why is he liable? For what purpose is a hole of any size, which includes a very small hole, fit to be used? Okay, you drilled a hole. What are you going to do with one little hole that you drilled in a piece of wood? What does that accomplish? So rather, is it not referring to one who drills holes in 2 or 3 different spots? And the reason that he is liable is that these holes are fit to be joined. Anybody that watches, woodworking and construction videos on social media, guilty from time to time. They didn't have the same kind of power tools that we have now, but they had a hand drill, which was capable of boring a hole in some wood. And sometimes the way they would bore a larger hole is to start with like 3 pilot holes arranged, let's say, in a triangle, and then, using his, to our eye, primitive drilling tool, would join the area between those 3 holes, and then he could make a larger hole. So these little pilot holes that are in an arrangement relative to each other serve a constructive purpose, namely to be the pilot holes for a larger hole that you might need for your construction project. Rather, is it not referring to one who drills holes in 2 or 3 different spots, and the reason he's liable is that these holes are fit to be joined? Builders who require a large hole will often start by drilling a few small holes, which they later enlarge and join together. By the same logic, if the meat was roasted in a few spots, he should be liable, as these can join together. Right? Meat roasted in a few different spots, even though it doesn't amount to a fig bulk, could act as the start of roasting the meat. That the roasted areas will join together. Gemara answers no. Actually, the Mishna is referring to one who drills in only one spot, as one can say that the hole is fit as an entrance, a levava, for the placement of the tooth of a key, which is very small. You're making a keyhole, and even the smallest hole can be the beginning of a keyhole. And there are those who say there is a different version of this discussion. Rava says even if the fig bulk of the meat was fully roasted on only one side and was distributed over 2 or 3 separate spots, he is liable for cooking on Shabbos. And Ravina said to Rav Ashi, we learn this law in the Mishnah as well. One who drills a hole of any size is liable. If you drill a hole on Shabbos, you're liable for doing work on Shabbos. What are the circumstances? If we say that the hole is in one spot alone, why is he liable? For what purpose is a hole of any size fit to be used, right, including a very small hole? Rather, is it not referring to one who drills holes in 2 or 3 different spots, and the reason he is liable is that these holes are fit to be joined? And similarly, in the case discussed by Rabbah, one is liable for cooking the meat in a few different spots because those spots can join together. And the Gemara answers, no, actually the Mishnah is referring to one who drills only in one spot, as one can say that it is fit as an entrance for the placement of the tooth of a key. And so, by extension, does that mean that the minimum size of area of a piece of meat, which if you roasted it on Shabbos would violate the prohibition of cooking on Shabbos, is a fig volume, and what you cook was a smaller area than that? Sounds like for cooking that wouldn't violate, whereas for drilling it would, because a drilled hole of any size can be useful for construction. A tiny area that was cooked within a larger piece of meat hasn't accomplished anything. Now, the Gemara returns to discussing the prohibition against leavening a meal offering. The sages taught in a baraisa concerning the deep pan meal offering, right? And the Torah specifies that different ways to prepare a meal offering. Really, just how are you going to cook it? Are you going to in a deep pan, in a shallow pan? Are you going to bake it? Are you going to fry it? They're all meal offerings, but they can be prepared in different ways. So the sages taught in Baraisa concerning the deep pan meal offering. The verse states in Leviticus 2, verse 11, "No meal offering that you shall bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven. For any leaven and any honey, you shall not burn any of it as an offering made by fire to the Lord." Right? So unless specifically requires leavening, all other meal offerings, no leavening, and no offering may be accompanied by honey. The Torah specifically prohibits bringing honey to offerings or with offerings. And we're talking about date honey. Now, the term meal offering is apparently superfluous, and therefore the Baraisa explains, if the verse had stated only, "Nothing that you shall bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven," I would say, I have derived only that the handful removed from the meal offering for burning on the altar alone is included in the prohibition, shall not be made with leaven, as what gets burned on the altar? The handful, the chametz, that is removed from a meal offering. But we've said that even the remainder, which is given to the priest to eat, neither can that become leavened. How do we know that? From where is it derived that one is liable for leavening of a meal offering whose handful has not yet been removed, even before the handful is removed? The verse states, meal offering, to teach that the prohibition includes a meal offering before the removal of the handful. The Gemara asks, since this verse is stated in the context of the deep pan meal offering, from where is it derived that one is liable for leavening the other meal offerings, which are not mentioned in this passage? Therefore, the verse states the inclusive phrase, no meal offering, to apply this law to all other meal offerings. The Baraisa continues to expound the verse. The phrase that you shall bring to the Lord indicates that this prohibition applies only to a fit meal offering, right? A meal offering that can be brought up onto the altar and offered to the Lord, but not to a disqualified meal offering. For example, a meal offering that was taken outside the temple courtyard or that was rendered tameh. It can no longer be offered on the altar. What if you introduce leaven to that, right? If you take an unfit offering, a disqualified offering, and you introduce leaven to that, have you violated this prohibition? From here, the sages stated that one who leavens a fit meal offering, he is liable to receive lashes. But one who leavens a disqualified meal offering is exempt, and that is the law. Now, with regard to the ruling that the prohibition against leavening does not apply to a disqualified meal offering, Rav Papa raises a dilemma. If one leavened the meal offering when it was fit, and subsequently someone removed the meal offering and it emerged from the temple courtyard and it was thereby disqualified, and then he leavened it again, what is the law? Is he liable for the second leavening as well? So the Gemara explains the possibilities. Do we say that since it emerged from the courtyard, it is disqualified in accordance with the status of a sacred item that left its permitted area and now can no longer be brought as an offering on the altar, and therefore when he again leavens it, he is not liable, because what is he adding leavening to? A disqualified offering. And we said that you're exempt if you add leaven to an offering that's already been disqualified. Or perhaps, since one already leavened the meal offering, right, at the beginning he already violated the prohibition, so it was already leavened when it was fit. And then it left the temple courtyard. Now, we've said that if you take a fit offering and it leaves the temple courtyard, now you've rendered it unfit and you can no longer bring it up on the altar. But he already disqualified the offering by adding leaven to it. So when it left the temple courtyard, did the act of leaving the courtyard do anything at all? No, right? Because what left the temple courtyard had already been rendered unfit. And we already have seen the law that if you add leaven to an offering that's already been disqualified by having leaven added to it, you are liable for the second leavening. And that's going to be the outcome here, it sounds like. Right? Or perhaps, since one already leavened the meal offering, from this point forward, the disqualification of a sacred item that leaves the permitted area is ineffective with regard to removing it from the prohibition against leavening, as the prohibition against leaving the temple itself applies only to a fit meal offering. And therefore, when he again leavens it, he is liable for that due to the prohibition against leavening a meal offering after one who had already leavened it. What's the answer? And the sages say, we don't know. Taiku, this dilemma shall stand unresolved. Rav Mari raises another dilemma concerning the leavening of a meal offering. If a priest leavened a meal offering while standing at the top of the altar, what is the law? Right? So when are you adding the leavening into this consecrated meal offering? It's prohibited to do it. But at what point did you add it? When you measured out the flour and consecrated it? When you mixed in water and created a dough? When you removed the handful? When you took that handful up on the altar? Just before you put it in the fire? And that's when you add the leavening to the handful while you're standing on the altar? Sounds like, well, it hasn't been burned yet. That should disqualify it, and you should be liable for introducing leaven to a meal offering. But are you? Let's see. Rav Mari raised another dilemma concerning the leavening of a meal offering. If a priest leavened a meal offering while standing at the top of the altar, what is the law? The Gemara clarifies the possibilities. The merciful one states in the Torah, no meal offering that you shall bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, which indicates that this prohibition applies only to a meal offering that has not yet been brought to the Lord, i.e., up on the altar. And therefore, as this meal offering has already been brought to the top of the altar, even though it has not yet been burned, perhaps it is not included in the prohibition. Or perhaps any offering whose burning has not yet been performed is considered like one whose action of sacrifice has not yet been performed, despite the fact that it has already been brought to the top of the altar. And if so, this meal offering is included in the prohibition against leavening. Which is it? No answer was found. Therefore, this dilemma shall stand unresolved. Teiku. Now the Gemara asks, okay, and now that the Tana of the Baraisa derives from the phrase, no meal offering, that the prohibition includes even a meal offering before the removal of its handful, which is going to get taken to the altar and burned, why do I need the phrase, quote, that you shall bring in the same verse? And the Gemara answers, it is necessary for that which is taught in a Baraisa. The verse states, that you shall bring, in order to include the meal offering, brought with the libations that accompany certain animal offerings, such as burnt offerings, peace offerings, and the sin offerings and guilt offerings of a mitzvah in the prohibition against leavening. Unlike the standard meal offerings, from which a handful is removed, these are entirely burned on the altar, and the additional derivation is necessary to include them in the prohibition against leavening. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili. Rabbi Kiva says this phrase serves to include the showbread in the prohibition against leavening. That's the 12 loaves that stand on the table, the special table, gold leaf table, that is in the sanctuary and has 12 fresh hot loaves of bread on it all week, and they're replaced on Shabbos, every Shabbos, when the temple is standing. And these were also large, unleavened loaves. Again, in the ancient world, don't think unleavened bread like matzah that's crisp. Think something like a very thick sort of tortilla or laffa bread, like a soft bread, cooked but unleavened and large. Actually, the ones in the showbreads were quite large. Now the Gemara clarifies these opinions. With regard to the opinion of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, the Gemara asks, how is it possible to leaven the meal offering brought with libations? This type of meal offering is needed only with olive oil, no water, right? And olive oil in this context is a type of fruit juice, meaning if you don't put any water in the wheat flour, it won't leaven on its own, right? Mixing in some oil or fruit juice will not cause that bread to leaven on its own. Now we're on page 57b, and there is a principle that fruit juices do not leaven dough. Reish Lakish says that Rabbi Yosef Galili would say, even though the oil of the meal offering brought with libations is plentiful, sometimes one might also need a meal offering with some water if he considers it necessary to add it. And it is fit. The water won't render it unfit. And if there's water in that flour, if so, it is possible for this meal offering to leaven due to the water, and therefore the verse that you shall bring teaches that the prohibition against leavening also applies to this type of meal offering. The Gemara asks, with regard to Rabbi Akiva's opinion, the vessel into which a tenth of an ephah of flour for baking the showbread is placed in is a measuring vessel for dry items. And we have heard that Rabbi Akiva said the measuring vessels for dry items were not consecrated as service vessels. This means the showbread becomes consecrated only when it is placed on the table in the sanctuary, right? Dry measures are not considered consecrated in the sense that they don't consecrate the meal offering that's measured in them. So the showbreads don't actually become consecrated as the showbreads until they're placed on the table in the sanctuary, according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. This means the showbread becomes consecrated only when it is placed on the table in the sanctuary after it has been baked. If so, at this stage, the prohibition against leavening is not relevant. After it's baked, it can't leaven. That's only the dough before it is baked. So in answer to this question, the Gemara states that Rabbi Reuven sent a letter from Eretz Yisrael to Babel, in which he cited a statement in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. This is the correct version of this baraisa, and one should reverse the names of the sages in it. The phrase, that you shall bring, serves to include the showbread in the prohibition against leavening. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosef HaGalila. Rabbi Akiva says, this phrase serves to include the meal offering brought with libations in the prohibition against leavening. Consequently, there is no contradiction between Rabbi Akiva's statement here and his statement with regard to the measuring vessels for dry items. The Gemara comments, and Rabbi Yochanan, who holds that Rabbi Yosef HaGalili is the one who maintains that the measuring vessels for dry items were consecrated, follows, ve'azda, his line of reasoning stated elsewhere. As Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Yosef HaGalili and one of the students of Rabbi Yishmael both said the same thing. And who is that student of Rabbi Yishmael? It is Rabbi Yoshia, as it is taught in a baraisa. The verse states, with regard to the consecration of the tabernacle and its vessels before their inauguration in the wilderness, right? The first time that they put together the tabernacle and collected the vessels from the 12 tribes that were brought by the princes of those tribes over the 12-day inauguration period. And it came to pass on the day that Moses had made an end of setting up the tabernacle and had anointed it and sanctified it and all its vessels and the altar and all its vessels, and had anointed them and sanctified them. Numbers 7:1. So Rabbi Yoshia says, the measuring vessels for liquid items, for example, oil and wine for libations, were anointed and thereby consecrated both on the inside and on the outside. The measuring vessels for dry items, such as measuring the tenth of an ephah of flour, dry items, were anointed and consecrated only on the inside, but were not anointed on the outside. Meaning there was an anointing oil that was used to inaugurate these vessels the first time that they were used. And where were they anointed? Well, the measures for dry quantities were anointed on the inside. Okay? So Rabbi Yonason says the measuring vessels for liquid items were anointed on the inside and were not anointed on the outside. Whereas the measuring vessels for dry items were not anointed at all. And Rabbi Yonason cites a proof for his opinion. You can know that the measuring vessels for dry items were not consecrated at all because it is taught that these vessels do not consecrate items placed inside them. As it is written, you shall bring out of your dwellings 2 wave loaves of 2/10 parts of an ephah. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven. for first produce to the Lord, Leviticus 23:17. So when are they considered consecrated to the Lord? Only after they are baked with leaven. This demonstrates that when the flour is placed into the tenth of an ephah measuring vessel, a dry measure, for measuring the meal offering, it has not yet been consecrated. The Gemara asks, with regard to what principle do Rabbi Yoshia and Rabbi Yonasan disagree? They disagree with regard to the interpretation of the word them in the phrase, and sanctified them in Numbers 7:1, right? When Moses sanctified all these vessels. So both Tanaim agree that the term them comes to exclude something from the anointing and consecration. He anointed them, but not these others. Rabbi Yoshia maintains that them comes to exclude, right, the word them comes to exclude the consecration of the measuring vessels for dry items on the outside, i.e. only the inside of these vessels are consecrated. And Rabbi Yonasan maintains that the measuring vessels for dry items are not sacred, i.e. they were not consecrated at all, and therefore it is not necessary for the verse to exclude them. Where it was necessary for the verse to exclude something, it was with regard to the measuring vessels used for liquid items to teach that they are consecrated only on the inside, but not on the outside. You couldn't take, a non-sacred vessel that contains this wine that you want to use for libation, take a consecrated measuring vessel and kind of dip it into the wine so that only the outside of the measuring vessel for wine, it comes into contact with that wine, and say that wine is consecrated. It wouldn't be consecrated. It wouldn't be consecrated until you put the wine for the libation inside that measuring vessel, according to this view. So the Gemara asks, since the dispute between Rabbi Yoshia and Rabbi Yonasan concerns the law of measuring vessels for dry items, let Rabbi Yochanan say also, as he did with regard to Rabbi Yosei HaGalili and Rabbi Yoshia, and he could come and say, Rabbi Akiva and one of the students of Rabbi Yishmael both said the same thing. And who is that student? Rabbi Yonasan. So the Gemara explains, Rabbi Yochanan did not say this, due to the fact that their opinions are not the same with regard to measuring vessels used for liquid items. Rabbi Akiva maintains that these vessels are consecrated at both the inside and the outside, whereas Rabbi Yonasan rules that they are consecrated only on the inside. Rav Papa said to Abaye, how can it be suggested, according to the opinion, that the measuring vessels for dry items were not consecrated at all, that the showbread is consecrated only when it is placed on the table? But before that, there is the stage in which the dough is placed into the receptacle, the bisa, in which it is kneaded. Isn't that a consecrated vessel, which in turn consecrates the dough that's going to be used to bake into showbreads? Since this vessel is used for liquid items, the dough should be consecrated at that point. Abaye said to Rav Papa, this is referring to a case where he kneaded the dough on top of a flat leather spread, which does not sanctify the dough. So the Gemara asks, well, if so, with regard to that which Rabbi Yonasan said to Rabbi Yoshia as proof of his opinion, that you can know that it is so, as it is taught that these vessels do not consecrate items placed inside them, so then Rabbi Yoshia could answer him with a refutation. This is referring to a case where he measured the flour for the 2 loaves of Shavuos in a vessel used for measuring a tenth of an ephah, but it was a vessel that was not sacred, and it is for this reason that the loaves are not consecrated. And the Gemara responds, how can these cases be compared? Granted, one can say that the showbread that was replaced every Shabbos was kneaded on a leather spread rather than in a receptacle, as the merciful one does not write in the Torah that one should specifically use any receptacle, in particular, to knead the showbread. Therefore, when one kneads the dough of a meal offering on top of a leather spread, we have no problem with it. But in the case of the 2 loaves of Shavuos, whose flour was measured in a vessel used for measuring a tenth of an ephah, since the merciful one states explicitly to use a vessel of a tenth of an ephah and measure with it, can it be suggested that the one preparing the meal offering should leave aside the consecrated vessel for a tenth of an ephah and measure instead with a non-sacred vessel to arrive at the tenth of an ephah volume? Of course not. Therefore, that's a ridiculous view. I'm almost done. Questions or comments? Get them in now. the sages taught in a baraisa. From where is it derived? From where is it derived? The one who offers up outside the temple courtyard a portion of the meat of a sin offering, or a portion of the meat of a guilt offering, or a portion of the meat offerings of the most sacred order, or a portion of the meat offerings of lesser sanctity, or a portion of the surplus of the Omer offering, or a portion of the leftover of the 2 loaves of Shavuos, or the showbread, or the remainder of meal offerings, that in all these cases he violates a prohibition, although these items are not meant to be sacrificed on the altar, right? So these are the portions of offerings that are not the portion that goes up on the altar. These are the portions of offerings that have a portion that went to the altar, and this is the remainder, okay? So what if he took that outside the temple and offered it up on a private altar? Now, when there's a temple, we may not bring offerings on private altars. But is it an offering? This is the part of actual consecrated offerings that wouldn't be brought up on an altar. So are you violating the prohibition on bringing up on a private altar when you bring up on a private altar something that was never meant to be offered on any altar? The Baraisa answers, the verse states, for any leaven and any honey you shall not burn any of it as an offering made by fire to the Lord. And the term of it teaches that any item that has already had some part of it burned in the fire of the altar is included in the prohibition, do not burn, stated in that verse explicitly with regard to honey and leaven. So the Gemara asks, and with regard to the 2 loaves and the showbread, is there some part of them that's burned in a fire? But isn't it taught in a baraisa, a portion of every offering is sacrificed on the altar, except for the 2 loaves of Shavuos and the showbreads on the table in the sanctuary? No part of them ever goes in the fire. Rav Sheshes said, although no part of the 2 loaves of the showbread themselves is burned in the fire, nevertheless, they are included in the prohibition against offering them up to the altar, since they are not viewed as independent entities, but rather as parts of larger offerings. The 2 loaves accompany the sheep sacrificed as burnt offerings on Shavuos, and are permitted for consumption only once those sheep have been burned on the altar. And similarly, the showbread is permitted for consumption only after the bowls of frankincense that were on the table with them have been burned on the altar. And there we will stop, take a couple comments. Reminder, no class tomorrow, Friday, as I'm getting a root canal, and we'll resume, God willing, Saturday night after Shabbos ends in LA. Sharon, the principle of matzah is that flour exposed to water for greater than 18 minutes begins to rise and is unsuitable for Pesach use. Is that matzah unacceptable as a meal offering as well, being considered as leavened? Yes. I don't know about the time of 18 minutes, but the idea is if you don't watch it, if you allow that dough to sit for too long before you bake it, exactly, it is going to be considered leavened and therefore disqualified for the same reason. And Bill, so generally we talk about fences around the Torah as a way of preventing people from accidentally violating the Torah. However, in this instance, I wonder the primary concern is in fact the appearance of impropriety. If the general public saw that the sages tolerated someone cooking meat in this manner, surely many would assume that this meant that one could engage in artifice to violate the injunction against cooking on Shabbos. Agreed. Maybe by Torah law it wouldn't matter if just a little bit became cooked. But what are you doing? For what purpose are you cooking it? You can't eat it, so what's the point? You're doing something because maybe, it got late on you on Friday and you didn't get your dinner ready, and now you're going to try to cook one little bit at a time and then eventually have cooked meat that you could serve. No can do. So whether it's to protect us from violating the actual prohibition on cooking or to keep us from the appearance of impropriety. I like that, Bill. I think that's a good point. Either way, that rabbinic prohibition is in place. That's what I've got for us today. God willing, see you Saturday night. In the meantime, good Shabbos.